Hi, I'm Cautex, and this is my Shadowlands patch 9.2 Arms Warrior Guide. The purpose of this guide is to help people new to playing ARMS in patch 9.2 get off and running. If you've seen any of my previous Arms Warrior Guide videos, then this video will be containing much of the same information, but it has been updated to reflect the changes made in patch 9.2, fix certain errors and inaccuracies, and add some new tips based off of things that I've learned and shared in more recent videos. I've also done extensive timestamping so that if you don't want to watch the entire video, you can quickly get to the topics that you're interested in, or skip topics that you don't care about, such as the following disclaimer. This guide is only useful if it makes sense to you and you're able to act on what you've learned. Whether or not it makes sense to you obviously depends on how I explain things. While I'll be doing my best to try and explain everything as clearly as possible, I sometimes have really weird ways of thinking about and describing things. Just because you don't understand something that I'm talking about doesn't mean that it's a confusing topic or that you're not smart enough or good enough to understand it. It means that I did not explain the topic in a way that works for how your brain likes to make sense of things. This is why I encourage you to seek out other guides as well, because someone else might have a way of explaining something that triggers that light bulb moment and makes you finally get it. If you're still confused about any topic that I cover or allude to in this video, feel free to ask about it in the comments and I will do my best to try and answer it in a way that makes sense for you. The next thing to understand going into this guide is that the information is only accurate as of the start of patch 9.2. Any future theory crafting discoveries, as well as any future patches or hotfixes, could make the information presented in this video entirely wrong. Now, with those disclaimers out of the way, let's get started. ARMS revolves around a rage management playstyle that focuses on how to make the most effective use of the rage that you generate. There are a ton of additional pieces that go into this playstyle, and I'll be talking about those, but all of those pieces more or less end up revolving around trying to answer the question, what is the best thing that I can do with the rage that I have right now? In order to prevent Arms Warriors from having a completely predictable rotation, Blizzard gave Arms Warriors Tactician and Seasoned Soldier. Seasoned Soldier makes your auto-attack crits generate 30% more rage, which for ARMS means that they're going to generate usually around 32 rage instead of the default of 25. Tactician makes spending rage have a chance to reset the cooldown on Overpower at a rate of 1.4% chance to reset the cooldown per 1 rage spent. In practice, this means that Mortal Strike, Whirlwind, and Rend have a 42% chance to reset Overpower because they cost 30 rage. Slam has a 28% chance to reset Overpower because it costs 20 rage, and Execute has between a 28 and 56% chance to reset Overpower depending on precisely how much rage you spend, because it can cost anywhere between 20 and 40 rage. On top of the variance that is created by the random chance to use Overpower more often, Tactician also creates a feedback loop for ARMS DPS. That's because using Overpower gives you a buff that stacks up to 2, which increases the damage of your next Mortal Strike by 20%. So using Overpower increases the damage of your Mortal Strikes, and using Mortal Strike will increase the number of times that you're going to get to use Overpower over the course of a fight. Because ARMS is all about managing the rage that you generate, another way of thinking about the ARMS playstyle is that it's trying to answer the question, what's the most effective use of my time based on the rage that I have right now? This is especially important because even though some abilities will cost rage, some cost no rage, and some even generate rage, they all functionally take the same amount of time to do. With this in mind, before talking about specific abilities, let's lay out the big picture priorities for maximizing your single target DPS as ARMS. As ARMS, for single target fights, your goals are as follows. 1. You want to maximize the uptime on debuffs such as Deep Wounds, Colossus Smash, and Rend if you're talented into that. Goal number 2 is that you don't want to hit 100 rage. Any rage that you could have generated while you were at 100 is rage that you lose and you don't get to spend on damaging abilities, and obviously, that's not good. 3, you want to get to 2 Overpower stacks so that you can increase the damage of your next Mortal Strike by 40%. 4, you don't want to Rage Starve. Rage Starvation is when you don't have enough rage to use the ability that you want to do. And your 5th goal is to do the highest damaging ability that's available to you at that time. Now, many of your global cooldowns will be doing things that are directly related to these goals, and a lot of the time, what you do during each GCD will benefit multiple goals simultaneously. So now that we have a generalized outline of what we want to do, let's talk more specifically about how we achieve those goals. Deep Wounds does ticking damage and increases the damage that you do to the target by a percentage that gets increased with Mastery. Deep Wounds can be applied by Mortal Strike, Colossus Smash / Warbreaker, Bladestorm / Ravager, and Cleave. I'll be talking about those other abilities in a bit, but for single target fights, the primary method of applying Deep Wounds will be through the use of Mortal Strike. And because of the duration of Deep Wounds being so long relative to the cooldown of Mortal Strike, you're not going to really need to worry about the duration remaining on Deep Wounds. However, during execute phases, depending on which legendary you're using, You might not be using Mortal Strike nearly as often as you would normally, so in those cases it would become important to track the duration of deep wounds. Next, whenever you use Colossus Smash or Warbreaker, it applies a debuff to the target that increases their damage taken for 10 seconds. I'll be talking more about these abilities in the cooldown section, but in general, you want to apply this debuff as often as possible. If you're talented into Rend, then you will need to reapply it shortly before it falls off, and I will be talking more about that in a little bit as well. Once you've done all these things related to managing your debuffs, then the next step is to not rage cap yourself. And really, not rage capping should be one of the easiest goals to accomplish because as long as you're following the ABC rule, which is an acronym for always be casting, then it should be exceptionally unlikely that you will ever rage cap because you're frequently going to be spending between 20 and 30 rage. And in the vast majority of circumstances, the global cooldown will be much shorter than the time it takes to do a melee swing. Next, because Overpower has a baseline cooldown of 12 seconds, whereas Mortal Strike has a baseline cooldown of 6 seconds, the only reasonable way to ever get 2 stacks of the Overpower buff is via Tactician procs, which means that you're going to need to be spending rage in order to get those procs. Yet another thing that this means is that if you're not at 2 stacks of Overpower and just got a Tactician proc, then you should spend that GCD to use Overpower, even if it means delaying a Mortal Strike, because you could potentially get another Tactician proc from that Mortal Strike. So if you didn't use it beforehand, there's a chance that you could completely lose it because it would just get overwritten. While in a perfect world, we would always have Overpower available to use whenever we wanted and could use Mortal Strike on cooldown 100% of the time, that world is not World of Warcraft. When you can't use Overpower and Mortal Strike is on cooldown, commonly the only thing that you're going to be able to use is Slam, which costs 20 rage. This can lead to problems if you're too aggressive with your range spending because melee swings occur every 2.4 GCDs, so if you get a melee swing and then spend all of your rage using slams, and then Mortal Strike comes off cooldown before your next melee swing occurs, then you're going to be losing damage because you rage starved yourself and are unable to use the ability that you would like to. A simple rule of thumb to help avoid rage starving yourself is to always try and stay above 30 rage as much as possible. This way you can always have enough rage to use a Mortal Strike when it's available. Now, some people will prefer to have that threshold set higher and want to have at least 40 rage, or potentially even more. Though, obviously, the more rage that you bank up, the closer you're going to be to rage capping, which is also bad, and thus you get to experience the game of rage management because you want to have your rage be high enough that you can do whatever you want, but not too high that you risk rage capping and wasting rage that you could have been generating. While charge doesn't do any damage, it's worth noting that if you're not going to have a melee swing occur during your global cooldown, and you're kind of close to becoming rage starved, then it's in the long run better to run out of melee range and then charge back in, as long as you're able to do that fast enough so that you won't delay the next melee swing. Once you're at 2 Overpower buffs, you have your debuffs applied, and you're confident that you're not going to rage starve yourself or rage cap, then what you should do with your GCD becomes a simple question of, well, what ability does the most damage? So let's talk about that. For the ARM's default abilities, Execute is the highest damaging ability, followed by Mortal Strike. Overpower and Slam do basically the same amount of baseline damage, but there are talents and potency conduits that can make Overpower do more damage than Slam. Plus, Overpower doesn't cost rage, so it's generally considered to be much better than Slam. Because Execute does more damage than Mortal Strike, generally speaking, we want to prioritize it over Mortal Strike. And on paper, it might seem like we wouldn't need to care about Tactician procs during Execute phases, since Overpower doesn't buff Execute. In reality, because Execute costs a lot of rage and does more damage the more rage that you spend on it, the best thing to do is use Overpower in between executes in order to give yourself time to have auto attacks land and generate more rage. Generally speaking, this is going to involve using Execute and then using Overpower or some ability that generates rage and then using Execute again. During Execute phases, you still want to be maintaining your debuffs like Colossus Smash, Deep Wounds, and Rend. But because we're not using our Mortal Strikes as often as possible anymore, that means that we need to be paying attention to our Deep Wounds timer. During Execute phases, you should be using Mortal Strike and Colossus Smash or Warbreaker to maintain your Deep Wounds debuff, with priority going to Colossus Smash, meaning that if you can use Colossus Smash, then do that to apply your Deep Wounds instead of Mortal Strike. The way that you handle Execute phases does change if you're using the Enduring Blow legendary, so please understand that this is the baseline approach to how to deal with Execute phases, and certain legendaries might change that. In 2-target cleave scenarios, you will want to be using Sweeping Strikes as often as possible, but other than that, for the most part, the decisions that you make won't be meaningfully different than what you would do in a single target fight. The one key difference is that ideally you should be trying to maintain your debuffs on both targets, which means that outside of Sweeping Strikes, you should be alternating which target you use Mortal Strike on, so that way you can keep the Deep Wounds debuff on both targets. When there are 2 targets, unless you're talented into Fervor of Battle, you should not be using Whirlwind. This is because with only 2 targets, it does less damage than Slam, and also less damage per rage spent. When there are 3 or more targets, you should be dumping Rage with Whirlwind instead of Slam when Sweeping Strikes is down. And once there are 4 or more targets, Whirlwind should replace Slam entirely, even during Sweeping Strikes. And this is assuming that you're not talented into Fervor or Battle, which, if you are talented into that, Whirlwind always replaces Slam at all times. The reason for this logic has to do with the damage that is done per rage spent of each ability. As the number of targets hit by Whirlwind increases, the damage done per rage spent also increases, and it'll eventually overtake the damage per rage spent of Slam, which can only hit a maximum of 2 targets during Sweeping Strikes. Colossus Smash, or Warbreaker if you're talented into that, is a 45-second cooldown that does slightly less damage than an unbuffed Mortal Strike, applies deep wounds, and also the Colossus Smash debuff for 10 seconds, which increases the damage done to the target by 30%. By default, this is a single target ability, but if you're talented into Warbreaker, it will hit all enemies within 8 yards, and apply the debuffs to any enemies hit. The optimal way to use this ability is to use it on cooldown, and to also try to stack it with other cooldowns, such as Avatar or Bladestorm. Bladestorm is a baseline cooldown for all Arms Warriors. Bladestorm has a cooldown of 90 seconds and does a fixed amount of AoE damage over 6 seconds, with the duration getting reduced by haste, such that it will do the same amount of damage just over a shorter period of time. Any enemy that gets hit by Bladestorm will have deep wounds applied to them, and while Bladestorming, you can auto-attack, but you can't use other abilities. On single target fights, the optimal way to use Bladestorm is as a way of having something to do if you're rage starved. Basically, if you're rage starved and don't have any other way of generating rage on that global cooldown, then use Bladestorm so that you can do some damage and get a couple auto attacks off during its duration. In AoE, Bladestorm is a strong damage cooldown and ideally should be used as frequently as possible in combination with other cooldowns such as Warbreaker and Avatar.
A surprisingly easy mistake to make while bladestorming is forgetting to face the mob that you're targeting and staying within melee range. This is important because if you're not doing that, you're not going to be auto-attacking, which makes you lose out on damage and rage generation.
Sweeping Strikes is a baseline ability for all Arms Warriors that makes your abilities hit a second nearby target for 75% of the damage that you did to the main target. In AoE scenarios, you should be using this ability as often as possible, while also trying to line it up with your other cooldowns and any relevant fight-specific timings. Skull Splitter is an optional ability that Arms Warriors can talent into that has a baseline cooldown of 21 seconds that can be reduced with haste, and it does roughly the same amount of damage as a slam. It also generates 20 rage. Skull Splitter is a great tool for smoothing out your rage generation when you're either unlucky with Tactician procs or play too aggressively and are in danger of rage starving. Rend is an optional ability that Arms Warriors can talent into that costs 30 rage, applies a 15-second debuff that deals bleed damage, and increases your critical strike damage against the target. If you take Rend, ideally you should have it on your target for the entirety of the fight. The optimal way to use Rend is to reapply it when there's less than 5 seconds left. If Rend is about to fall off and you're considering reapplying it, but you know that your target won't be alive for at least another 12 seconds, then don't bother reapplying Rend.
In 2-target cleave fights, the optimal thing to do is to make sure that you reapply Rend just before Sweeping Strikes ends. Doing this should allow you to maintain nearly 100% Rend uptime on both targets. Something to note, however, is that there is a bug with Rend and Sweeping Strikes where the cleaved Rend does not grant the crit damage bonus. With that said, because of how Sweeping Strikes calculates its damage, this bug only really matters if you have cleaved a Rend and then need to swap to that target.
Cleaves is an optional ability that Arms Warriors can talent into, and it costs 20 rage, has a baseline cooldown of 6 seconds that can be reduced with haste, and hits up to 5 enemies in front of you and applies deep wounds to them. If you have any overpower stacks, then using Cleave will consume them, and make those stacks apply to cleave damage just like it does for Mortal Strike. In AoE scenarios, the optimal way to use Cleave is to use it the same way that you would use Mortal Strike in single target scenarios, meaning that you should be using it as frequently as possible, but you also want to prioritize having 2 stacks of the overpower buff. Now, Cleave doesn't replace the Mortal Strike ability, so when running Cleave in AoE fights, you can use Mortal Strike as a filler when you have extra rage to spend, assuming that it wouldn't be more damage to use a Whirlwind. On single target fights, you shouldn't be using Cleave at all. Avatar is an optional cooldown that Arms Warriors can talent into that increases your damage by 20% for 20 seconds and generates 20 rage when used. Avatar has a 90-second cooldown, and the optimal way to use this cooldown is to just use it as often as possible, while also trying to line it up with any fight-specific damage amplifications or burn phases, and also your other cooldowns. Ravager is an optional ability that replaces Bladestorm that Arms Warriors can talent into. Ravager does less damage than Bladestorm, but it's on a 45-second cooldown, doesn't take away player control when used, and generates 7 rage each time it does damage. If you decide to take Ravager, it's best to be used alongside Warbreaker or Colossus Smash because they both have a 45-second cooldown. This also means that if you're also talented into Avatar, every other Ravager will line up with Avatar. There are two default talent builds for Arms Warriors, a single target build and an AoE build. Certain covenants and legendaries will incentivize taking certain talents, so please understand that the builds that I'm about to discuss are the generally best ones, but your choice of covenant and legendary might make a different build more optimal. I'll be talking about these variances as they come up in the covenant and legendary sections, but just remember that you should always sim yourself to precisely see what's best for your setup. For single target fights, you will need to choose between taking Skull Splitter and taking Sudden Death. The simple answer to which you should choose is whatever Raidbots tells you, but the way that this decision works is that Sudden Death provides a roughly constant percent increase in your DPS regardless of your gear and group comp. Skull Splitter, on the other hand, sees decreasing returns as your gear improves and depending on your group composition. This is because it gets a significant amount of value from the rage that it generates. As your gear improves, or if you have an enhancement shaman in your group, your rage generation can increase to the point where you don't need an extra source of rage in order to fill most of your global cooldowns. And at that point, taking Sudden Death will definitely be better. In the second row, by default, you're going to want to take Double Time, which greatly improves our movement capabilities. In Mythic Plus or in PvP, it's not uncommon to take Stormbolt instead to gain the utility provided by the 4-second stun. In the third row, you're typically going to take Rend, which is, as previously mentioned, a debuff that costs 30 rage, it does ticking damage, and increases your crit damage against the target by 10%. In scenarios where you might not get full value out of Rend, such as in Mythic Plus, especially on Fortified weeks, it's not uncommon to take Massacre instead of Rend. In the fourth row, you're typically going to want to take Defensive Stance, but Bounding Stride is a ton of fun, and occasionally there will be encounters where the AoE damage doesn't trigger the waiting period for Second Wind, which in that case can't make it incredibly strong. In the fifth row, you're typically going to want to take Warbreaker. Technically speaking, collateral damage and Warbreaker have precisely 0 impact on your single target DPS, so as long as you're one of these two talents, it doesn't matter. In the sixth row, you're going to want to take Avatar. This is because Deadly Calm is typically pretty garbage outside of execute windows, and In for the Kill only procs when you personally cast Colossus Smash or Warbreaker, meaning that it won't proc from our strongest single target legendary. In the seventh and final row, you're going to want to take Dreadnought. This is because it greatly increases the strength of Overpower and makes filling all available global cooldowns a much easier task. Anger management is decent, but only if it allows you to have your cooldowns line up with damage amplifications that you normally wouldn't have cooldowns for. Ravager is generally only good if you're taking the Signet of Tormented Kings legendary, and since it's no longer the best single target legendary for Arms Warriors, it's pretty rare that you would want to take this talent. Maximizing your damage done with Dreadnought requires good positioning. The way that Dreadnought works is that it draws a line between you and the target that you hit with Overpower. This means that the direction your character is facing has no impact on the direction of the Dreadnought lines, and standing closer to the mob that you're targeting will make the lines go further behind your target. Your top 2 potency conduits are going to be Crash the Ramparts, which increases your overpower damage, and Mortal Combo, which gives Mortal Strike a chance to cast a second time whenever you use it. However, because most circumstances is not all circumstances, and because the best soulbind trees for some covenants opt for 3 potency conduits, let's talk about some of the other potency conduits and when you might consider using them. Prior to patch 9.2, generally speaking, the default choice for your third potency conduit was Adaptive Armor Fragment, and in most cases, for single target fights, that will remain the case. With this new patch, Merciless Bone Grinder's benefit has been doubled, making it a much more competitive option. On AoE fights and in Mythic Plus, if you're running a triple potency setup, then Merciless Bone Grinder will be your best choice for that third slot. Because of this buff, there's also a strong argument to be made in favor of running Merciless Bone Grinder instead of Mortal Combo for Mythic Plus, even if you're only running 2 potency conduits. The tricky thing about this decision is that simulations will typically assume that you're able to hit mobs for the entirety of the Bone Grinder buff. Getting a scenario like that in practice means that the mobs need to survive for around 15 seconds or longer, as they need to be able to survive for a full Bladestorm plus the full buff duration. If you're not running higher keys, then mobs are less likely to live for that long, and as a result, the value that you would get out of Merciless Bone Grinder will go down because you're just simply not going to be able to make full use out of the buff. Because of this, the best suggestion that I can give is that when you sim yourself, unless Merciless Bone Grinder is a massive improvement over Mortal Combo, the safer pick might still be Mortal Combo, depending on how long you anticipate pulls actually lasting. Now, each Covenant has their own unique potency conduit, so let's talk about those. If you're Necrolord, Veteran's Repute will give you strength every time that you use Conqueror's Banner, and this potency conduit will outperform Adaptive Armor Fragment for your third potency conduit. Though it is likely that Merciless Bone Grinder is going to perform better than Veteran's Repute for AoE encounters. If you're Kyrian, Piercing Verdict is decent, but it typically does not outperform Adaptive Armor Fragment in single target DPS, and it will not outperform Merciless Bone Grinder in AoE DPS overall, though it does perform better in short burst windows when you wouldn't be able to get much benefit from Merciless Bone Grinder. If you're Night Fae, Destructive Reverberations should not be used because it causes Ancient Aftershock to become desynchronized with Avatar and Warbreaker, which actually severely impacts the value provided by this conduit. If you're Venthyr, don't bother with using Harrowing Punishment because the radius of the damage bonus is exceedingly small to the point where it rarely gets activated.
In patch 9.2, you will be able to unlock the Memory of Unity, which enables you to equip a regular legendary and also your Covenant-specific legendary at the same time. This makes picking a Covenant also determine what second legendary you get to wear. For your regular legendary, the two best legendaries for single target and AoE are still going to be the same as it's always been for the majority of this expansion. Enduring Blow is the best single target legendary regardless of your Covenant. For high target AoE, Signet of Tormented Kings is going to be your best AoE legendary.
Enduring Blow gives Mortal Strike a 25% chance to apply the Colossus Smash debuff for 6 seconds. This legendary interacts with a couple other mechanics for arms wearers, so let's talk about that. If you're using the Mortal Combo Potency Conduit, that additional Mortal Strike can proc Enduring Blow as well, meaning that if you're lucky, you can get 12 seconds of Colossus Smash from a single press of your Mortal Strike keybind. Additionally, during sweeping strikes, Mortal Strikes cleaved onto the second target have their own independent chances of proccing Enduring Blow that is not tied to a proc on your primary target. And on the flip side, proccing Enduring Blow on your main target will not cleave the application of the debuff onto the target being hit by sweeping strikes. Because of how strong the Colossus Smash effect is, it's generally best to continue using Mortal Strike as much as possible during execute phases when running this legendary. The Signet of Tormented Kings legendary power makes casting Bladestorm, Avatar, or Recklessness cast one of the other effects alongside it. In more practical terms, this means that whenever you cast Bladestorm, it will also give you either Recklessness or it will give you Avatar. When you cast Avatar, it will also either give you a Bladestorm or Recklessness.
As for your Covenant, there's really only two meaningful choices, Kyrian or Night Fae. The other two Covenants are currently not performing well enough in either single target or AoE to be meaningfully viable. If you decide to go Kyrian, then you get access to Elysian Might, which doubles the duration of the Spear of Bastion ground effect, making it last 8 seconds. Standing in that ground effect will grant you a 25% crit damage multiplier. If you go Night Fae, then you will get access to Nature's Fury, which increases the duration of Ancient Aftershock, and makes its ticking damage apply a stacking dot. If you decide to go Kyrian, your best soulbind for both single target and AoE is going to be Mika Nikos. While using this soulbind, you should go the path of grabbing all 3 potency conduits and Soul Glow Spectrometer. If you decide to go Night Fae, then for single target, your best soulbind is going to be Dreamweaver. While using the soulbind, you should go the path of grabbing all 3 potency conduits and Waking Dream. For AoE, you should soulbind with Karain and then opt for grabbing First Strike rather than running triple potency. You should also grab Hunt's Acceleration. Now, both Kyrian and Night Fae perform very similarly in single target DPS. Generally, Night Fae sims higher, but part of those numbers are assuming that you will be able to get full value out of Nature's Fury. This means that the mob must not move for 15 seconds. If you cannot ensure that this will happen, then Nature's Fury is going to lose value. Obviously, Kyrian also suffers from this problem, as you need to be standing in the ground effect to gain the crit damage benefit. But it's more likely that a mob is going to not move for 8 seconds than it is for the mob to not move for 15. Also, because Spear of Bastion has a shorter cooldown, missing out on the full benefit of one spear will be less impactful to Spear's overall damage than missing one Ancient Aftershock is to its overall damage. In practice, which of these two Covenants is better comes down to how much movement is going to occur during the encounter, and when exactly that movement is going to occur. In my opinion, Kyrian is the safer choice of the two options. That doesn't mean that you're not going to see me going Night Fae when the situation is right. In AoE, in most cases, Kyrian is definitely better than Night Fae. But it performs best when you need to do mass AoE on lots of mobs. If the fight has adds that are constantly trickling in, then Night Fae can excel due to how powerful First Strike is.
Now, your stat priorities will change depending on pretty much every single little variable that I've talked about in this video, as well as the stats on your current gear. You can run a stat weight simulation on Raid Boss with your personal setup to get a better understanding of what stats are best for you, but please keep in mind that there are a number of fundamental flaws with doing that type of simulation. So,
In practice, it's better to just follow what Top Gear says is the best item for you. With that said, generally speaking, crit and haste will be your two best secondary stats, followed by mastery and versatility. This is because haste increases the number of GCDs that you're going to have available to you over the course of the fight, and it will allow you to fit more globals into Avatar, Colossus Smash, and etc. Something that I think is important to mention is that haste does not affect rage generation in the way that you might think. Even though you do more rage generating auto attacks, because you have more GCDs available, the proportion of rage generated per GCD available will remain the same. This means that if 5% of your global cooldowns get unused due to lack of rage, even if you magically got 20% more haste, 5% of your GCDs would still go unused due to lack of rage. Crit, in addition to giving you a chance of basically doing double damage, also increases the rage that you generate through Seasoned Soldier. Now, because crit makes auto attacks generate more rage, and this has no effect on the number of GCDs available to you, that changes the proportion of rage generated per GCD available. So, to use our example of starting with 5% of our globals going unused due to lack of rage, if you magically got 20% more crit, that might bring that number of unused global cooldowns down to maybe 3% or even lower. That is why crit and haste are so strong for warriors. As for the other two stats, versatility simply gives a flat percent increase to our damage, which is always good. And then mastery for arms gives us the deep wounds dot, which provides ticking damage, and also a percent damage increase to targets with this dot. In practice, this dot should be up 100% of the time, so it functions kind of similar to versatility. The damage done by this dot can crit and is also affected by versatility, and its tick rate is affected by haste, so increasing your other secondary stats also increases the value of mastery. Again, these stat priorities that I talked about are generalities. All of our secondary stats are good, so do not think that just because an item doesn't have a particular stat that it is bad. Use tools like raidbots to get more accurate information about your specific stat needs. The standard opening rotation for single target DPS as an arms warrior is to charge the boss, then apply Rend, then cast Avatar just before using Colossus Smash, then you would use your Covenant signature ability, then Overpower, and then Mortal Strike. From there, you would transition into following the goals that I laid out earlier in this guide. Now, there's a couple variances to this. For example, if you're Necrolord, because Banner does not do any damage, it is better to use it before you cast Colossus Smash. And if you're Venthyr, once you've used Colossus Smash, you should simply follow the execute window priorities. There are also a lot of little nuances to the opener that could incentivize deviating from the standard. And generally speaking, there isn't a significant difference between most of the variations of the ARMS opener. So even though this is the standard, don't be afraid to experiment by switching things up a bit if you think that there's a better way. In patch 9.2, new tier set bonuses have been added, so let's talk about them. For arms, the 2-piece bonus makes Colossus Smash last 3 seconds longer, and makes the Colossus Smash debuff increase your damage by 35% instead of just 30%. Something to note is that Colossus Smash debuffs applied by Enduring Blow do not get the extra 3 seconds of duration, but it does get the extra 5% damage done effect. This 2-piece bonus has no meaningful impact on Arms Warrior gameplay, and simply functions as a straight damage buff. The 4-piece bonus has a sort of confusing wording, so I'm not even going to read it, and instead I'm just going to explain how it works. There are 2 parts to this bonus. The first part is that while the Colossus Smash debuff is active on your target, the chance of getting a Tactician proc is increased by 50%. So if you remember back to earlier on in the video where I showed the probabilities of getting a Tactician proc for each ability, well, basically what the first part of the 4-piece bonus does is that it multiplies all of those numbers by 1.5, which you can see on your screen. The second part of this bonus makes it so that using Overpower via a Tactician proc grants you a 2% strength buff that stacks up to 4 for a total of 8% strength. Using regular Overpowers not granted through Tactician do not grant this buff. The 4-piece bonus impacts the Arms Warrior playstyle in 2 ways. First, it will mean that you're going to have more Overpowers during your burst windows, which is quite good. The second thing is that you're going to have to babysit your pylon stacks. Because regular Overpowers don't refresh the duration of the buff, maintaining your stacks is contingent on getting Tactician procs. If you're just really unlucky, then it's more than possible to lose your stack. Because of this, it might be worth being a bit more aggressive with rage spending to try and fish for Tactician procs if there's less than 5 seconds left on your pylon buff. And that is everything that I think you need to know in order to play an Arms Warrior in patch 9.2. I hope that this guide has been helpful for you. As patches, hotfixes, and new theory crafting discoveries occur and change what the best practices are for Arms Warriors, I will be making videos discussing and analyzing them. If you're confused about any part of this guide, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to help you out. Alternatively, tell me why what I've said is wrong and why my opinions are dumb. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video and subscribe for more.